You could almost subtract the PD from that.
Well, I would argue the PD shouldn't be in here because everything we do in PD is everything we do. It's pedagogy.
Right.
And everything we do under pedagogy is IB philosophy. So, but we would do it without it. We still have to do PD. So.
Okay, but to put on the devil's advocate hat, training for IB PD would displace other PD options. So I guess some of this comes down to why PD and not something, why IB PD and not something
Not
else.
necessarily, because the IB training that we do isn't just IB philosophy. The IB training we do is grounded in the content area. So when we send our teachers to IB training, it's math specific, or it's English specific. It's based on their content area, so it's not just a philosophy. And we send our special ed teachers to inclusion training. We send our ESOL teachers to like languages. So there's a whole, our administrators go and they get trained on being better leaders. So no, I would say that it doesn't take away from other training.
Mr. Nkuma?
Can I suggest we remove this and have you go back and map out IB, AP, and then net it out for a better, because I think we're just playing with numbers here. And the best way to do it would be to put them side by side and see what the net effect is. Because what I'm hearing is this is not a zero-sum game. Maybe it's a zero-sum game, I'm not sure. But if the money's not spent on IB, it will be spent someplace else. So it's not fair to label IB as costing X amount of dollars. Well, clearly, this number's wrong.
I agree with
so
you.
let's
I don't
have it
think
done
it's
some
fair.
other way and remove
Yeah.
this chart and bring us a revised chart at some later point. That's my suggestion.
No, I think it's a good starting point, and it was good to have the discussion.
Thank
So
you.
now we know, it helps you frame like what questions do we want to ask next, and how do we want to present it. So thank you for putting it together at the last minute.
Well, it certainly made me an inquiry-based.
And are there any other questions from anyone? Before adding on, I guess Mr. Castillo made the comment, and I guess I've asked a question before. I'm not sure if it's a Virginia law that requires the payment of those testing things, because I don't even know if every jurisdiction in the state pays those or not. So I always wonder about that part of it.
Well, and it's not.
Or is it our?
Well, here's the deal. It's not necessarily. It's not a Virginia law specifically. You must pay for IB exams. But the fact of the matter is that because we have this program embedded in, as basically our GT program, and if you want to take upper level classes, this is what we're offering, and exams are part of that. We cannot pass the expense on to parents because basically in providing a free and appropriate public education for these students, we're saying here's the courses you need to take, and by the way, these exams are part of that. And that's part of their education.
And that's because of being an IB diploma school versus just being AP makes a difference in that regard.
And we pay for AP exams as well.
Yeah.
It's based on an attorney general's opinion, and the attorney general's opinion actually is about AP. But basically, the reasoning of the opinion is if it's required as part of the program, be it AP or IB, then it has to be paid for by the division.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. We will move on to our next topic. A review of the cutbacks and impacts on the FY17 budget.
A little while ago, I asked staff to work with principals and to try and determine what was the impact that you've experienced as a consequence of the cutbacks last year in the budget. And what Lisa and Hunter and staff have put together is this listing and a cogent explanation of what the impact of the reduction was. And you've had this for a period of time to be able to look through. I don't need to walk it through. We are ready to answer any questions. But I do think it's important that people realize that when you cut a sizable amount of money from a budget like last year, that those cuts do have impact, programmatic and on personnel.
And Dr. Schiller, and also I took the liberty of just making a few notes here and some takeaways. after I reviewed the list, because it was very telling. In many areas, to be honest, there was no impact. For example, the annual donation that we were making to the Falls Church Education Foundation, we no longer had to do that because the Education Foundation has become much more financially robust and is now, serving the purpose for which it was intended. We were able to realize savings in our insurance costs, and that was just by putting them out to bid. Our retiree health insurance payments that we made into the trust fund, those were actuarial payments that we were able to realize as well. So really, in terms of programmatically and staff-wise, they had no impact. Others have impacts that have to do with, I think, long-term planning and also short and long-term risk. I'm thinking specifically of like the lease purchase of the school buses. I think it was don't get me wrong, I think it was a very good move to move towards the lease purchase of the school buses. However, what that means now, instead of putting money in for one bus every year, we're now going to have to spread those payments out into the future and commit funds in future budgets towards that. Also, the contingency, bringing the contingency down. We've been fortunate this year. We still have about $100,000 left. We started the year with slightly over 150. But and I know this is an area where the board has discussion every year, at least 2 or 3 times, and during the budget, just in terms of what is an appropriate amount, what could possibly happen, these sorts of things. And I think especially as we begin to trim in other areas and hope for the best, I would hope at some point the board would go back and revisit the contingency as well. I think in terms of the reductions of staff, the obvious big impact there was in fact class sizes, that some of the class sizes are currently larger than they might have been otherwise had we been able to add the staff we had hoped to add. In terms of the reductions that were made to the various pay plans, whether that was the teacher scale, the leadership scale, the stipends, it did have an impact in a couple of ways. One, competitiveness. We did slip a little bit in terms of our teacher competitiveness with Arlington, and also given the fact that for the past 2 years, support staff have received steps only without any adjustments to those scales. We've provided information to show that in fact where we used to be like a 1 and a 2, we're now a 2, a 3, or a 4 in terms of regional competitiveness. Huge impact on morale, to be honest, in terms of listening to the employees and the employee groups who are grateful for what they got, but on the other hand, when the health insurance increased significantly, for many staff members, their take-home pay is less this year than it was the previous year. Dues and memberships, we thought this was an easy no-brainer, at least I did, and I thought, well, we'll just cut back. Got a call from Amy Kurjanowicz. One of the casualties of this cut was membership in high school guidance associations, which is a very valuable resource for the high school and also an area where they have publications. Also, what we're finding with the dues and memberships is, and for example, with the National School Board Association, if you're not a member, if you turn around and want to go to a conference, it's going to end up costing you more money to go to that conference. And lastly, in the areas of materials and supplies, we'll talk about that later. That has really, I think, between last year and this year, I think we've kind of, at least my analysis indicates we've kind of reached a turning point there. So those were my takeaways.
Okay. Are there any questions? Mr. Lawrence.
Well, not so much a question, just pointing out as you go through here, I mean, you look at the costs, but then when you look at the words, students are impacted through a loss of guided reading time, significantly impacted quality of program for students, class sizes increase, specialists do not have the same personal connection with each class, some people are paying annual dues and memberships out of their own personal funds, result in one classroom not being equitable as compared to other classes. I mean, it's not just, well, they had to pay more for snacks on their own. I mean, this is something that's affecting the teachers. It's, affecting central office morale, and it's hitting the students. I mean, that's the bottom line. Is we can't pretend that having to cut this $1 million last year didn't affect the students this year. So that's really the bottom line we need to keep in our minds.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Mr. Castillo?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. One question about the security cameras. My recollection was there were going to be some cameras donated, and is this net, the donations were still not enough?
Correct, Mr. Castillo. We did receive the donations. We're very, very grateful for those. However, given the number of cameras and the needs of the school system, and we try to meet the need as best we can, but there's a lot of need out there.
And that has a potential safety or security impact, or are the unreplaced cameras still operational?
There are older cameras in place that are not as reliable as others, and they do deteriorate over time.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? We will review of materials and supplies
Yes.
for FY18.
That gives us a segue, moving from the cutbacks to, I asked again, pushing staff hard here to put a lot of stuff together for us and for your consideration. Wanted to see where we stood with student instructional materials and supplies, particularly over a 7-year period, and to what extent there's equity among the schools, and to what extent you can see and will be able to make a stronger argument of what we need in order for our teachers to be able to have what they need in order to go forward in the classrooms to the highest level possible. There are some you've had a chance to read through all this school by school, and also Hunter was good enough to be able to differentiate a little bit of what each of the schools receive and how they use it. Hunter, you want to do a highlight here, or should we just open it to questions?
Could I just ask one question to help explain before you start explaining? On the first page of this thing, in the right where it is the column is titled SW, is that system-wide?
That is system-wide.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there any significance to the fact that there are 5 different sizes of X's?
There is, in fact, a significance to that, which
Okay,
I'll be
then
happy
I'll
to speak
get out
to.
of the way and you can explain.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. And thank you for noticing the size of the X's. I was going to see if anybody would pick up on that. Essentially, went back into our finance system and pulled data on materials and supplies spending that are impacted on a per-student basis. So what this means is that the school buildings, it would be the classroom supplies in regular ed, special ed, CTE, STEAM, gifted, ESOL, library materials, guidance materials. Again, more students, you need more materials. Some of the office materials, more students equals more materials. So that was really what was included in this. Those things that need to be purchased, the consumables every year that are really driven by the number of students you have. The spending per student at every location has decreased over the past 7 years for a number of reasons. One, for various reasons, the budgets have been decreased from time to time, whether it was the recession in 2009-10, whether it was a conscious decision that we need funds in other areas and that we'll just simply have to make do with less materials and supplies, but the budgeted amounts overall have decreased. At the same time, our number of students has been increasing at all locations, and therefore you're taking a stagnant or shrinking number and dividing it by a greater number of students, coming out with a smaller amount per student. Mr. Castillo likes to remind us inflation it's a huge impact. And going back and looking at the Washington-Baltimore Consumer Price Index over the past 7-8 years, it's a 12.5% difference that you've lost in buying power over that period. So your buying power has decreased as a result of the inflation.
In addition to the nominal decrease in dollars.
Correct. And then the analysis, I show it both ways, the nominal dollars and then the inflation adjusted dollars. And interestingly enough, one of the biggest factors that comes into play, and one location in particular, has to do with the grade reconfigurations between and among the schools. Cutting to the chase, it appears that what happened when the 5th grade moved back to TJ, the funding for materials and supplies did not follow the students as a result, and they were basically budgeted for 3 grade levels. They now picked up 4 grade levels, and
How did that happen? I mean, it just
Oops.
seems like somebody would have noticed in 5th grade.
well, we notice now. Anyway, in terms of the chart and what's included in each location's budget, you will notice that the spending per student varies right now significantly, or does vary between each location. And this is for a number of reasons. TJ, simply because it really appears that they did not get the funding along with the 5th grade. George Mason appears to be abnormally high at first pass, except if you look at the chart and go to the GM column and say, okay, what's in the GM budget? Well, for example, at George Mason for student activities, given the number of clubs and teams and those sorts of things and activities, that the larger X means that in turn at George Mason, the student activities supply budget is significantly larger than it is at other buildings for a very logical reason. Likewise, there is computer software that is very specific, like to the high school. For example, like the Turnitin software, things like that, which they don't have at other schools. Both Mary Ellen Henderson, George Mason, and system-wide have textbook budgets specifically. In fact, the lion's share of the textbook budget is actually in the system-wide curriculum area, and that is for adoption of textbooks and materials. So there is a reason why the X's are larger, and also under GM, it's the only location where we specifically budget for athletic supplies. So hence those areas are driving up the per student materials and supply expense in those locations.
So athletic supplies are included here
Yes.
in instructional materials and supplies. Okay, for every school or just GM?
GM is the only school that has a specific line item for athletic supplies. Given the thing is, those are funded by collecting student fees, the pay to play. So that's the funding source there behind those athletic supplies. There are PE and other sorts of supplies in the other buildings, but and for example, the PE program at George Mason, when we buy supplies there, that comes out of regular ed supplies. That does not come out of student activities, athletics. Athletics is the teams.
Okay.
So, Hunter, I'm sorry, I'm not following quite what you said.
Yeah, okay.
So I get that there's a separate line item for George Mason athletics, and I remember looking at that last year, and we talked about things, and actually it was on the thing that we just went through in terms of the cuts that we made last year. But the athletic supplies for the teams are not included in the dollars that are presented here.
They are included in the dollars.
But so this is gross and not net?
This is the amount that is expended every year. That if you pull our books and you run how much we spent on student supplies, this is part of that number.
So it includes the athletic fees.
Yeah, we include the athletic fees in our income side,
Revenue,
right?
in our revenue.
So that's so the athletic fees are included in our revenue, and the expenses are included in the expense side.
And if I can
Okay,
intuit where
gosh.
you're going, yes, we can parse those out.
So let's just say this is gross and not net.
Correct.
And this is a slight departure. Has an analysis been done of any appropriate savings from the deployment of the personalized learning initiative and technology in particular in terms of reduced costs for paper and those sorts of things?
And the answer there is yes. Under the first bullet, we do, in putting budgets together, adjust from year to year to reflect actual spending. So this, would include, savings from efficiencies as well as other areas where we specifically know certain items are going up.
Understood, but it would be helpful to understand when you get to the recommended changes, whether that's been addressed in the recommendations that you've made.
Okay. Okay, very good. So we've got all this data. What do we do with it? I took an initial pass at it. Dr. Schiller did. A couple of other people have weighed in. In moving forward, thought, well, let's just start somewhere and throw out a proposal, which would be to bring the school budgets back to their FY15, FY16 per student levels, and then also make a separate adjustment for enrollment and for TJ, because given the situation there. In doing so, it would carry a price tag of about $114,000, which is hefty. But it would also mean that all locations, materials and supply budgets would increase by various amounts. And every location would get additional funds as a result of that. Dr. Schiller,
That'll take you back to your 2015 level.
Okay. And everybody's still better off.
Questions, other additional questions? Mr. Lawrence?
Now, student instructional materials and supplies includes office supplies, clinic supplies. So this includes all the front offices for all the schools too, right?
Basically, think of your school building, okay, and all the supplies in that building that you need to purchase based on the number of students you have. So yes, the clinic, more kids, more Band-Aids, more students, more whatever, papers or Friday folders or what have you.
Okay. I guess where I'm going with, well, I'm not, I guess where I'm going. I'm going to why don't we include central office here? Because it seems like you've got all the front offices, but central office is sort of left on its own, and I don't know where we would include that.
Well, to the extent that there is spending that impacts students directly, that is budgeted system-wide as part of the central office budget, if you will, there are, and it's predominantly, well, it's all in the budgets that Lisa and Jeannie control and work with, and work with the principals over, which has to do with textbook, instructional materials and supplies, system-wide things. Honestly, in terms of the central office and other sorts of materials and supplies or whatever, it's not so much for us students necessarily as it is staff. And honestly, right now we've gone to issuing paychecks electronically or pay stubs electronically. We push information out not on paper but over the internet. So really, as Mr. Reidinger was pointing out, we have been able to achieve efficiencies. At the CO, but the things were included under the system-wide budget, which one could consider, well, that's in the central office, that are directly related to students and numbers of students, have been included in that column and in the last category on the page.
Okay, so your 114 doesn't completely ignore central office, but it doesn't take all of central office into consideration either.
That's fair.
That is correct.
Okay.
Really, it's that which is driven by the kids, the students.
Right. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how much isn't taken into consideration Because it seems like central office is always the one that's left behind. It seems like to a certain extent we're doing that again here, and I think we've neglected to focus on central office for way too long. So I'm just trying to get a handle as to how much, what's the percentage that of all central office expenses for supplies and materials that aren't in here?
And to be honest, from my cursory running through the list and categorization, I would say that in recent years, where the greatest need has been system-wide and in the central office has been in the area of technology, whether that's purchasing licenses to, for certain, safety programs or, security programs. I know that Mr. Brett, in terms of our putting our school board meetings up on the web and in the internet, there are increased legal demands in that area. Fortunately, there are also solutions out there, but they're not free. That really seems to be the area where, given the changing environment and, whether it's people trying to hack you or, a court telling you, thou must do this, that we have to respond to and where the need is increased.
But wouldn't that be part of the technology budget?